And welcome back to another episode of the On Coaching Podcast. I'm Steve Magness, the Deputy Director of High Performance West, joined as always by my good friend and colleague John Marcus, Director of High Performance West. John, we're back.
Been giving the people what they want since 2015.
I love how you know the date. And you know why we're able to give the people what they want?
Why? Please, let me know.
Because of Final Surge, our sponsor for this podcast. Final Surge allows us to do this at a more regular basis and bring in cool people to talk to like we're going to today. What is Final Surge? It's a training and coaching platform that allows you to look at, log, do all this awesome stuff. In fact, I spent my Sunday utilizing it with my college team, and I have 30-ish athletes spread all over the U.S., a couple in Michigan, and I just went through their summer logs and just commented, looked at who was doing well. It had ratings for how well their runs were going and colored in, red or green if it was good or bad rated, and it took me no time to go through 30 athletes and figure out what I needed to adjust, who needed a call up and some coaching, and who was cruising along in the summer. So
what I love it is the cook is eating his own cooking here with the Final Surge. So if you don't have it, get on it. It's a must. And you know what? Our listeners can save a couple bucks, several bucks, lots of bucks with a special coupon code we have for Final Surge. Steve, what's the coupon code?
All caps, on coaching. You can find that also on highperformancewest.com in the show notes, or if you go to finalsurge.com/oncoaching and then enter the password, that helps out a lot too. But you can save some bucks. It's well worth it. It saves me time, energy, and makes me more efficient in my coaching, which does what? Allows me to spend more time actually coaching and less time worrying about, recording everything that I need to that doesn't really help me get athletes faster. So who do we have this week on our podcast? We have two guests. It's a special podcast. Len Zakowski and Dan Peterson wrote a wonderful book, The Playmaker's Advantage, How to Raise Your Mental Game to the Next Level. They'll be joining us. Len is a sports psychologist who did pioneering work at Boston University. Dan Peterson's a consultant in the sports psychology work. They came together and wrote this fantastic book, and we will be talking to them next.
And I wish that this book was around 15 years ago when Steve and I started coaching, because I spent 10 years of my early coaching career going out and finding piece by piece, scrap by scrap, a lot of the things that they have in their book, and they have it all together in one resource. So, I'm hitting my head against the wall, the table, because I wish I would have waited a little bit, but, otherwise I wouldn't have known what I know now. But this is a definite go-to resource. It's phenomenal. They talk about a lot of the things we've touched on throughout the podcast in the last 3.5 years, and they also apply it to a team sports setting, so it's applicable not only to more individualized sports, but also those sports that have a ball and have several players on the field at once.
Yep, so let's jump into this conversation. Before we do, just a reminder to always check out what we're doing at High Performance West. We'll be back and with regular scheduled programming August 1st, I believe it is, John.
No, July 29th. Get
July
it right,
29th.
Man. That's why he's the deputy director and I'm directing.
That's right. I don't know what's going on. I just know when I need to create content. But we've got some exciting new content that will be coming around the corner, so be sure to check that out and keep listening and share it with all your coaches. And without further ado, let's jump into our conversation. And we're excited this week to welcome the authors of The Playmaker's Advantage, Leonard Zakowski and Dan Peterson. Guys, welcome to the On Coaching Podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, so I'm real excited this week because for those of you who don't know, Len and Dan both look at the psychological side of sport. And they've written this fantastic book, The Playmaker's Advantage. And we're going to delve into a little bit of what they covered in the book and then also what they cover in their real lives. But before we jump into that, I'd love to hear just kind of how you guys came together to write this great book. Like, what was the pull or the calling to put this out there in the world?
Sure. Well, I'll kick that off, and then Len can jump in. So I am the non-expert, non-academic among all of us, and I'm a sports dad. I spent my career in health information technology, working with hospitals, etc. But my wife and I raised 3 boys. They're all under 20s now. But growing up through, the young ages into high school sports, a couple of them into college sports, they all played soccer. They played multiple sports when they were growing up. And I was always just intrigued as a dad watching them from the sidelines, and just how they did what they did out on the field from a cognitive standpoint. Not so much from a sports psychology, motivation and attitude and all of that, but just from a cognitive skills standpoint. Obviously, there's kids who are fast and tall and better endurance than some of the others, but just how they make all of those decisions, and especially in a kind of what we call invasion type sports, soccer, hockey, basketball, rugby, etc., and how they make all of those quick decisions out there, some better than others. And notice that some kids, and then I did a little bit of coaching of my own, and noticed that some kids just pick that up faster than others. And I was intrigued by that. And so over the last 10 to 15 years, I've just, it's been a side hobby of mine to read everything I can, the research reports, all of the great stuff that's out there. And I started a blog about 8 years ago, 80% Mental. And that grew over time. And I got an opportunity to work with a few sports science companies who had training equipment coming out for this type of cognitive training. And one person I met there was Len, who was the academic, the director of sports science at several of these companies, and we got to know each other. Well, anyway, a couple of years ago, I thought, I would really like to write a book on this stuff. And my wife looks at me like, what do you know? And I said, well, I've been reading a lot of this stuff. And she's like, okay. But I knew that, in the nonfiction world, and Steve knows this as well, that you really need that expert. For someone to buy your book, if you're going to come out and try to give advice, etc., you need someone who's actually walked the walk. And obviously, Len is that type of person, with 40 years at Boston University as a sports performance psychology professor, known all around the world, etc. And so I gave Len a call, who recently retired down to Florida, and I said, Len, how would you like to write a book? And he didn't hang up on me. It was a good thing. And I talked about the concept of this book, and he said, yeah, I'd love to. He's written textbooks, he's written 300 academic papers, but never written one for the masses. And so I talked him into it. He was very gracious to join me on this project. And 2 years later, we just released the book last month, and it's coming out in the UK on the 9th, August 9th, in Australia on August 1st. And it's been going great, and it's been a fun project. So Len, I'll let you add in from there.
Oh, thanks, Dan. That's well said. Interesting. Dan and I initially met working with probably somebody you gentlemen know, Rudy Chapa in Portland. And certainly I knew Alberto Salazar from his running days, lived not far away from me, actually, in Massachusetts. And it's kind of coincidental that, Jonathan, you do a lot of work out there in the Portland area. But about 5 years ago, we were both doing a fair amount of consulting out that way and got to know each other, and it kind of led to this project. And just to elaborate a little bit on what Dan was saying, you try to make a difference in people's lives and being outstanding performers from the youth level up to the Olympic and professional level. And I call it simply education, and that's what you gentlemen are. You're coaches and teachers above all, and I can't stop teaching. And I reflected back on the work I did at Boston University, training graduate students, consulting with groups from youth to pro level. I thought that, gosh, my impact was pretty minimal. Yeah, I influenced a lot of graduate students, but still, there's a lot to be taught. And I've always had the sense that people who wrote books that got some traction really had a huge impact. And I'm thinking of our good friend, we became friends with David Epstein when he wrote The Sports Gene. It educated a lot of people, kind of destroyed a lot of myths about genetics and human performance. So being the educator, I thought this was a great idea, and we took off, and we went at it pretty hard. And as you probably noticed, we focused primarily on team sports, but by golly, I couldn't resist getting into track. I had a lot of passion for it, and I had one of the great track coaches and performers at Boston University, David Hemry. And you probably noticed I talked quite a bit about David and the impact he had on me. I may have had on him, but there was a champion, or if you wanted to bring it to track, he was the kind of the ultimate champion, and certainly a playmaker, although it's less common in the world of track and field.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's cool to see how it came together. And in reading through this, I guess let's jump into some of the findings you found in the book. I can't resist with Dan. You said that you got into this world through essentially helping your own kids out. And one of my favorite lines or favorite phrases that you guys use in the book is, I'll just quote the sentence, "Watching elite athletes and coaches on television or remembering their own sport experience contributed to treating their kids as short adults." I love that phrase of short adults, and I'm going to steal that from you guys, I think. But I guess you guys have a long chapter on here on that phenomenon. What advice maybe could you give to youth or the high school age coaches in terms of looking at that? What should they be looking at development during those early years?
Well, I think if we could start with my former student, who's kind of the guru now in pediatric strength training, emphasizing the importance of youngsters' strength and conditioning to actually engage in any kind of team sport. And certainly track and field is the very best place to start, because you have to do whatever sport you play. Its foundational skill sets come out of track and field. And so Avery emphasizes the fact that we have so many kids playing computer games now, not very physically active, that they've got to have at least modest conditioning to start participating in sport. So that's really important. And then as far as, the coaching, the kind of skill sets that they have to develop are really foundational, basic things, not high level. So it's a long-term athlete development process that many parents and young coaches overlook. They see the models on television with the elite performers, and that's how they think their kid should be coached. That kind of brings us back to the small adult. Dan, you may want to expand upon what I've just stated.
Yeah, absolutely. And in addition to Avery Feigenbaum's life's work, trying to teach physical literacy, these kids need to learn how to run and jump and skip and do these basic things before they can be taught advanced sport skills at such a young age. But also a quick story about the gentleman who wrote the foreword for the book, Mike Sullivan, head coach of the Pittsburgh Penguins. And a quick story, when we were early on, when Len and I were early on and planning for the book and thinking about things, and I brought a YouTube video to Len, and I said, "Hey, check this out." This was from a couple years ago. Mike Sullivan was giving a talk to a USA hockey coaching symposium, and this is before he had joined the Pittsburgh Penguins and head coach. He was a consultant for the Blackhawks, but he was standing up in front of 250, 300 hockey coaches at this symposium, and he just went on a 45-minute talk all about the brain. And he was telling these coaches, guys, this is the next competitive advantage. You have to learn how to teach. You have to learn how your players learn. You have to learn age appropriateness. Because he said, we all know how to do the physical stuff, but he said, this is what it's going to take for the next generation. And so much so, and then, of course, I bring that to Len, and Len goes, "Oh, Sully? Yeah, he went to Boston University as one of my students when he was playing hockey there." And I said, "Of course you know him, Len. Of course you do." And so Len called him up, and we had a great conversation, and he ended up writing the foreword. But if I could, to that topic, Steve, I'll just read you a quick little quote from the foreword that Mike Sullivan wrote. And he says, "I've always been a big believer in age appropriateness when you're coaching sports. If I'm coaching a group of 8 and 9-year-olds, I can't go out and run the same practice that I'm running with the Pittsburgh Penguins. Cognitively, they're at very different stages than grown men. I need an understanding of what their limitations are, where their potentialities lie, so that I can focus on certain things that can leverage that knowledge. The reality is that kids are not miniature adults. Their brains are different. They're not fully developed. I listen to parents in the stands around the rink and hear comments like, 'Little Johnny doesn't pass to my son because I think his dad gives him $10 for every goal he scores.' Well, maybe little Johnny's peripheral vision isn't fully developed, so he doesn't see your son on the back door." And so I mean, that's basically what he's saying is, and what Dr. Feigenbaum has been saying is, you have to understand the level of player that you're working with there. One other quote that we put in there from a gentleman named Istvan Balyi. Dr. Balyi has been around the long-term player development, athlete development for many, many years. He helped USA Hockey develop their player development plan. He helped US Lacrosse develop theirs. And he tells this little quip about, this is quoting Dr. Balyi, "I learned this from Jesuit priests in Ireland. If you want to teach Latin to Johnny, you have to know Latin, and obviously you have to know Johnny. So instead of Latin, if you want to teach any sport to Johnny, you have to know that sport and you have to know Johnny. But," he says, "we know the sport very well, but we do not know Johnny or Jane from age 6 to 16. Superimposing adult programs on young developing athletes just doesn't work." And so that's one of the messages early on in the book about you have to know the players and the age that they're teaching. And I would guess it's the same for you guys in teaching them running events, track events, etc.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there, Dan Len. Like, copycat syndrome is so prevalent, especially in sport. And it's just, you want to cut and paste the workouts that you see the stars athletes doing, or, for us, like our U.S. champions or American record holders, and then just scale them down so that, younger athletes in the youth or high school categories or scholastic realms are feeling like they have some confidence and legitimacy in the work they're doing because, hey, this is what we saw the U.S. champion in the 5K or 10K do for a workout on, something that was promoted, and we're just going to translate that to us. So, but, for them, I always remind people, like, athletes at the elite level, they got to elite level because they've been doing sport and progressing through sport for 10, 15, 20 years, maybe over half their lifetime, right? So you can't really ask someone who is training age 3 as a high school junior just doing track and field for the first time and expect them to do, say, a scaled down version of a workout that Alan Webb did in 2007 when he was on a tear and arguably one of the best seasons that an American distance runner ever had. And I think there's confidence in that, but there's also a lack of depth. And so what I'm curious is, through you guys' research in the book, or researching the book, how prevalent did you find that copycat syndrome amongst coaches or even parents or people who are nurturing young athletes? And how, what methods did you find to combat that perception or that desire just to cut and paste what the stars were doing or the adults were doing down to the younger levels?
Well, I'll take a shot at that. Yeah, that's well stated, and really what you're saying, what you did in one of the podcasts, the perpetuation of myths. There's so many myths out there. But the example I'd like to share with you right now is it comes back to the decision-making process. And when I was in Australia in March and April of this year actually, and a soccer group invited me to come and talk to them and observe their training sessions, and their system over there is, as you well know, it's from youth right to the professional level. And these were youth coaches working with young soccer players. And I was observing some of the drills they were doing, and they were the kinds of things you'd expect, the tight area drills. So they're doing drills so that kids can get force them to make decisions faster. And so I asked the coaches, I kind of commended them for doing that. And I said, so, why are you doing that? And the coach says, well, it's to give the kids more touches so they can touch the ball more often. On a big field, they never touch the ball in a 1 hour practice. Then I asked the question, well, don't you also think that what that drill really is doing is it forces the kids to make decisions with that ball much quicker? So you're confining the space and the time, and they've got to make quicker decisions. And so my mindset is all around decision making, and theirs was someplace else. So, well, we never quite thought of it that way. So many times coaches will mimic drills that they see done, but are not exactly sure why they're doing them. And I guess that bothers me a bit too. So that these are pretty bright individuals by and large, but rather than trying to think of ways in which you could create situations, put youngsters in high performance situations that have to make quick decisions, they copy what others are doing, and oftentimes it just does not fit.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, Len. We've all heard the story, I guess, myth, however we want to talk about, with the 10,000 hours and Dr. Erickson's work as interpreted by Malcolm Gladwell and Outliers. And so one of the great things working with Len is he can call these guys up and we can get interviews. So we called up Dr. Erickson and we got an interview for the book, and we talked to him about all of that stuff. There's a chapter about practice and designing practices, etc. And one of the things that he said is, yeah, the whole 10,000 hour thing, that kind of got blown out of proportion. But he said, I'll still go back to, the original intent of that research, and the conclusion he was trying to make was about deliberate practice and making practice specific to an individual's development. And often in a team sport, it's hard to do when you're one coach and you've got 25, 30 athletes and you got to keep everyone busy. Are you really paying attention to each person's development and doing things that are appropriate to them? And it's tough to do, but that's one of the things Dr. Erickson pointed to. And I'll read you a quick quote that we have from him. It says, Dr. Erickson, I'm basically arguing that when you look at a lot of the practice that I've seen visiting all sorts of different teams, very little of that is actually even getting close to this idea of individualized deliberate practice, where somebody's doing something that is uniquely appropriate for them to improve some aspects of their performance in some individualized context. So he's still saying, kind of forget the 10,000 number. We're getting a little too obsessed with that. Let's focus back on our coaches designing practices that improve individual components of each person's game, if you will.
That's phenomenal. And I can, in an earlier life, I was actually the head girls soccer coach at my high school for 4 years. That's actually how I got my start in coaching, was being a team sport coach. Mm-hmm. And I always talked a lot to my athletes and those young women about decision making and trusting themselves and trusting their teammates. And recently I was with Mike Smith, the head coach at NAU, and we were sitting trackside at Peyton Jordan when Andy Truard, was the past NCAA indoor champion in the 3K, ran, a 13:20 or so 5K on the track, big PR, great race. And the first thing that Coach Smith asked Andy when he came over, and he said, tell me about your decision making out there. That was the first question, even in an individualized team sport or individualized sport setting where this athlete has 12 and a half laps on the track at a high level to process and think. He wasn't worried about tactics or the competitors, Coach Smith, like myself, a younger version of myself as a soccer coach, was more concerned with that decision making. So through you guys' research and through you guys' creation of the book, can you speak to some of like the decision making progressions that ideally any coach for any level dealing more with a younger demographic of, say, middle school, younger high school age, and then young adult might want to look at or think about integrating in some way, shape, or form into their practice plan or into their practice environment to help those athletes at that cognitive developmental age be able to get the most out of their participation in the sport versus just solely being focused on numbers, wins, losses, running miles, or setting PRs.
Yeah, I'll go first on that one. One of the things that you're exactly right. One of our goals for the book was to really start a conversation, to introduce some vocabulary of how coaches and parents can talk about these cognitive skills. And it goes even to the title of the book. As Len warned me, he said, if you start talking about the brain too much or cognitive and use all of these academic words, you're going to lose them. So we thought, well, what is a term that most parents, coaches, sports fans understand that may explain what we're trying to get at? And that's where we came up with the word playmaker, because in a lot of team sports, soccer, hockey, basketball, etc., people know what the playmaker is. They're the person who's out there with a better sense of field vision, court vision, awareness. They make passes that are maybe not available to other players. And so that was kind of the basis of all of these cognitive skills of awareness and perception and decision-making, etc. One of the other things that we added in the book, in the middle 3 chapters, part 2 of the book, is we introduced a concept called athlete cognition, and then broke that down into 3 phases. And the way we saw it was, this is the never-ending loop that a player goes through. Picture a center midfielder in soccer. What we broke that down into is search, decide, execute. So hundreds of times a game, they have an opportunity to search, use their visual perception, take in all the information on the field, and then take all that information and make a decision. Find the best option and decide, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to pass over here. I'm going to dribble the ball here. I'm going to shoot. And then finally, the skill acquisition part, the ability to execute the decision that you've chosen. And sometimes those all feed on each other. You won't make a great decision if your perception isn't very good. As Mike said, if you don't have the peripheral vision to actually see opportunities that are out there. If you don't have the physical skills of making a 40-yard pass to a player across the field, you may not choose that option. Or if you do, you may not make that pass very well. So we talk about the research in each of those areas, or human perception, decision-making, and then skill acquisition. And one of the guys that we really love talking to is Professor Damien Farrow, who is a skill acquisition expert down at the Australian Institute of Sport. And he used a very interesting analogy that I thought was really good. He talked about Dr. Seuss books. And he goes, everyone's read these to their kids. And he goes, you take a Green Eggs and Ham, for example. He goes, in Green Eggs and Ham, there's a total of about 50 words in the whole book. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And he said, but what Seuss does in his original attempt to help kids learn how to read is he'd take those words and just keep mixing them up in different orders, different sentences, etc. And you do that over and over and over. You keep the vocabulary limited, mm-hmm. but yet you recombine things in practices and drills over and over so that they can understand what's going on. And a quick quote from him, he said, all of these books by Seuss with their rhyming phrases repeat time and time again. Then they switch, then they repeat, then they switch. It's essentially what we've been talking about with this in-task switching, and he's the master of it. Most of us with kids have taught them to read using this type of material. The same principles readily transfer over to skill learning as well from the physical perspective. So that's some of the stuff we've tried to introduce in the book, and I'll let Len take it from there.
Yeah,
let me interrupt you, Glenn. I exactly just did this today at practice this morning for this podcast. So I'm working with 414 1500 meter runner, 206 800 meter runner that I coach here in Portland, and she's had a lot of injury history, like hiccups here and there for a variety of reasons. And I mean, even though we've done a lot of our due diligence beforehand to minimize that, they keep being expressed. And so finally we said, okay, we really did a deep dive on form and did a deep dive on her biomechanics and said, fundamentally, it's how you're impacting the ground and like other issues, kind of up the connect chain that are impairing you and creating these overuse injuries, even though we're really working hard to like minimize them. So today we're working on how she's running essentially with one leg, and we're just focusing on how it feels and really critiquing just the right leg. And I didn't even like talk about the left. She said, "Oh, do you want to transfer and try to do it with the left?" Like, nope, just the right, the right, the right. Hone the right. Let's really have different drills, some debriefs with video, and get that firing as best we can. I mean, this has been ongoing now for 3 weeks, and we've just been focusing on the right. And then finally, her proficiency was so good relative to where she started. I said, okay, now let's try to do some 100-meter strides, 100-meter on, 100-meter jog around the track, and now integrate the whole chain, the left and the right, but just maintain the feeling of fluency that you've developed and just have that feel, very continuous throughout your running mechanic. And without, any coaching to the left side, because we had honed that right side so well and she was able to focus on that, the left side just naturally followed suit. And it was, we have video of her and we looked at before and after from 3 weeks ago to today. And it was just amazing that she was able to digest that, interpret it, create this physical literacy, and fluency based off this mental discipline and practice that was just solely geared towards getting one side of her stride cycle to be more proficient, and then magically it's like the other side follows suit. It's not quite as difficult as, say, trying to kick a soccer ball, hit a baseball or shoot a jump shot, but I just wanted to hop in there because like you're exactly right, this green eggs and hams approach, minimizing the inputs but really honing on like the high important input and just repeating it over and over and over again, it works. And it even works with adults. This young woman's 29 years old and it's working.
Yeah.
Great story.
Yeah, if I can jump in too, it's that was probably one of my favorite parts of the book that you guys looked at, and this is the essence of coaching, right? Is what, like, how do you change these behaviors and skills in the manner that you want to? And I'd love to have Len talk a little bit about his experience and his research on this, because let me find it real quick. One of the things that really caught out to me is there was this study that you guys mentioned on basketball shooting drills and explicit versus implicit coaching instructions, on how explicit instructions made some players better, but it made some players worse, and that was based, I think it was on working memory capacity. But I'd love for you to maybe dive into a little bit on how best to communicate and set the changes we want about.
Well, boy, this is great. That was a great example of creative coaching, and I try to talk about many places in the book that coaches, rather than mimicking what other people are doing, can just ask the question, like, how can I be more efficient as a teacher, coach, and be creative in doing it? And people oftentimes come up with good solutions. But a couple of things I want to expand upon on this current discussion is that what Dan was talking on, the first part of the decision-making process is the kind of searching, or we might see, and that can't be done without a lot of focus and paying of attention. And so we're always going to be having young athletes who have difficulty maintaining attention. But there's ways in which we can train attention. And in the book, I talked a little bit about using the neuro tracker, multiple object tracking, that I've used in team sports very successfully. And that the use of that technology is really gaining a lot of traction in recent years. And Steve, I know this. You talked about using the Stroop test as a method of helping focus attention. It's a wonderful exercise. And the point I'm making here is that sports just vary so much on kind of what goes into cognition, kind of the searching, the deciding, and the execution. They're all a little bit different. And I think we gave the example of in baseball, for example, you got 200 milliseconds as a hitter to make a decision as to what kind of a pitch you're getting. Is it a fastball, breaking ball, changeup? Is it going to be a strike or a ball? But you've got that real small window to make a decision. And that's kind of unique amongst sports. Cricket's got that same component too. Golf doesn't take a lot. You're walking to the ball. You've got plenty of time to think about what you're going to be doing. So it's not critical there. So they're all just a little bit different. And so that decide part is really going to be a function of the sport they're in. But I think just heightening the athlete's awareness about decision making. And it's going to happen in running. Not so much perhaps in the short distance ones, but like the sprints, but the long distance ones, you have to make decisions for when to make the move, when not to. But making the athlete aware of the importance of decision making and believing in the decision that you're going to make. And that last part that Dan talked about in this cognitive cycle, the execute part, is that execution comes through that drill and practice, the multiple ways in which you structure the drills and exercises to help the athlete master the skill you're trying to accomplish, so that they can execute it flawlessly in the heat of competition. It's automatic. They don't have to think about it. But the moment they start thinking about it, then it gets into that the phase we talk about in the end of the book, where we unfortunately call it choking, but they fail to execute. And it's because they went out of that automaticity and into the analytical thinking mode, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, to add to that, and that's exactly, I think, Steve, what you were referencing, that actually the two researchers who were working on that, one is Rob Gray at Arizona State, who's also got an amazing podcast, and he and Cian Bylock, who used to be at University of Chicago, they did some great work on those choking studies and the basketball example you gave. But yeah, that's the point they made, that there were two main theories of why athletes choke when the pressure situation comes upon them. And one was a distraction theory, that just the noise in the crowd took their attention away from what they should be doing. But a different theory was this explicit monitoring theory of, as Len said, when they actually start, things aren't going well, and they actually start breaking down a unit of skill that they've been doing for years and years, like, for example, shooting a free throw, and all of a sudden they can't shoot a free throw, or they talk about the yips in golf. And that's the explicit monitoring, when they're actually starting to monitor the different components of a complete skill. Like, they're starting to think about their arm angle, they're starting to think about what their stride is, etc. And that automaticity gets lost, and then everything starts to fall apart. And so that's what they talk about. Maybe a better way to teach skills at the beginning is this implicit learning, where you're teaching the entire skill as a whole, and coaches aren't breaking it down into pieces. And the example they always give is, riding a bike. You didn't learn to ride a bike by working on pedaling one day and balancing the next day and steering the next day. You did it all at once, and that's how you learned it, and it can't be broken apart. And so that's what Gray and Bylock came out with, is the real cause of choking is this explicit monitoring, and some different strategies of how to avoid that when you're actually learning the skill.
Yeah, that's great. That was really interesting as well on the choking. Wish we had a better term for it, but
yeah, it's a kind of pejorative thing. And I mentioned in the book that oftentimes it isn't a choke. And I use the example out of baseball. You got the best pitcher in the world and the best hitter in the world. Somebody's going to win this one-on-one.
Yeah. And
the person that loses it, he choked. Well, no, like, he got that pitch. It was an unhittable pitch. So, but yet the sports writers refer to he choked. Yeah, unfortunately.
Fortunately, yeah, but that's a great point to make, because I think you guys tied it into Kahneman's System 1 versus System 2 of thinking as well, which is a good way to just kind of conceptualize it. Because I think in our sport especially, what happens is, because it's so simple, like running or throwing or whatever is relatively simple, we tend to break it down into the minute details of the mechanics, sometimes at the detriment of of the whole thing, right? So I think, maybe if you guys could speak on part of that in terms of drills, of how you balance that, breaking it down, working on a specific component versus integrating the whole that you mentioned there, Dan.
Yeah, and you're right. The chapter we have on decision making, we did talk a little bit about Dr. Kahneman's famous System 1 and System 2. And also, it was just interesting, just last week, doing some research for something else, Len and I were lucky enough to talk with Dr. Gary Klein, who also has, along with Kahneman, a complementary theory of decision making. And for 30 years, Dr. Klein has studied people in their workplace making decisions under time constraints and high pressure. For example, firefighters, military, police officers, etc., and has come up with a whole kind of parallel theory with Dr. Kahneman's of what he calls recognition prime decision making, where his theory is, instead of coming up with some hypotheses and then going out and doing some lab work to see if those are true, he kind of flipped it, and he went out to talk to fire commanders who have been in forest fires or house fires, etc., for many years, and talked to them and interviewed them about what their thought processes were, how they made decisions in those crucial moments. And what he found is that rather than follow a procedure or a bunch of if-then rules, they had to build this tacit knowledge, this knowledge of intuition, this knowledge of experience, and build that over the years, so that it seemed like intuition in the moment. They knew exactly what to do, just like a playmaker on the field seems to know exactly what to do. But that really came from years and years of seeing lots of different patterns and understanding how all those work together. And so his comment, we asked Dr. Klein, we said, so would all of your work and concepts and framework, would that work in sports? And he said, absolutely. He said, in fact, he goes, I'd love to work with some more teams, because he said it's the same thing, especially a team sport. You're under time constraints, you're under pressure. Now, how do you build that tacit knowledge in a developing athlete, and how do you get to have them see so many different opportunities at every practice, so that day by day, week by week, they build up that experience level and that database of all those patterns, so that when it's game time, their subconscious picks the right one and knows what to do in the moment. And so I think that's one of the things he would recommend, other coaches have recommended, of instead of rote drills, the infamous dribbling around cones or whatever, if you can make the practice much more game-like, but in a smaller setting, as Len said, so they get more touches, then every minute that they're there at practice, they're building that tacit knowledge database. So, Len, anything to add there?
Well, a little more on that question you asked about when do you, as a coach, break things down into units versus teaching the whole. Tomorrow, we're going to have Vern Gambetta, who's doing a podcast with us, and he's been preaching the whole concept, kind of whole mind-body concept for generations, if you will. Wonderful man. He's so knowledgeable. But there are times when it's appropriate as a teacher and a coach to break down certain skills, but you have to do an analysis, see if it lends itself to it. And the old motor learning concept that I learned years ago, the fundamental rule was, if it lends itself to a discrete breakdown and you're not messing up the whole sequence, if it's a serial skill, for example, that one movement depends upon the other one, kind of in a kinetic chain of events, it's probably not wise to break it down and practice an individual part of it. Do the whole thing. But where there are instances in sports skills where it's not sequentially dependent. You're not going to mess it up. Then you can go ahead and break it into that small component, practice that, get that down, and then go on to the other part. But if they're really sequential and serial in nature, it's probably not a good idea because you're going to mess up that whole kinetic linkage. And I think as track coaches, you've experienced it a lot. So it's a decision you have to make as a coach. But you've got to first ask that question, is this skill one that can be separated in a reasonable way?
Oh, that's perfect advice. I think that's a great heuristic and a question that we all need to ask. Well, awesome. I think one of the other things that I found really interesting in the book was, actually, before I go there, you had a section, or you had a paragraph on runners' attention during a race. And I think it was in one of Lynn's sections, actually, on internal versus external focus that I think would be really interesting for, since we have a lot of runners and a lot of coaches to on this podcast to hear maybe a little bit about that, if you remember that part.
Oh, thanks for asking that. Yeah, I almost forgot about that part where I've just been most fortunate after the fact to have 2 winners of the Boston Marathon as my master students, and I stay in close contact with them. Not so much with Greg Meyer, but I do with Jack Fultz, and we meet every year and play a little bit of golf and reflect on our experiences. But they were both Boston Marathon winners, and about the time they were being successful, Bill Morgan, professor at the University of Wisconsin, had been doing some research with runners and wrote about this association and disassociation phenomena. Like that his argument was that the great runners really associate with kind of the pain that's going through the body as they're coming up to Heartbreak Hill in Boston in the marathon. And in my experience in talking to people like Jack Fultz, that they said we just move back and forth. There's sometimes that you would associate with your body and kind of how you're feeling, and what kind of adaptations am I going to make at this point in the race? And then there's other times that you can totally dissociate. And for our listeners who may not know what that is, the dissociation is something like imagining that you're a steam engine and you've got to go up this hill and your legs are pumping like the pistons on a steam engine. And that's kind of the total disassociation. Or there may be something else that may not even be, you're just thinking of something different to get your mind away from it. But then you flip back into the association phase. That was my sense of how the great runners really do it. And the more recent research really has confirmed that the great runners don't just use one strategy, they'll use multiple strategies of both association and disassociation. So I hope this helps answer your question a bit.
Yeah, it does. Excellent. No, I think that's such a great point to make because, I've heard coaches, researchers, etc., argue over that, and I've always seen it as like, hey, if you can have more tools in your toolbox to use or more strategies to use while you're going through that painful moment, the better. You just gotta, flip back and forth and find what works in that moment, essentially, right?
Exactly. I think that's right. The key, to like hit on is like what works. And I remember myself as a young coach, and and just for your knowledge, like Vern Gamet is a close friend and mentor to both Steve and I, so we know Vern very, very well.
Looking forward to tomorrow, yes.
Yeah, no, totally. And when I was a younger coach, there's such a mountain of evidence and experiential evidence and knowledge and wisdom, and there's so much out there, right? And even your guys' book, perusing through it, all this stuff when I first would have read it maybe 15 years ago when I was just getting into coaching would be overwhelming, but because I've seen a lot of this work and you guys have made great connections with the people you've interviewed and also how you outline it to make it very affluent and very easy read, you don't have to apply everything. And I always remind people of that too. It's the difference of following a recipe versus knowing how to cook. And I think we want recipes because they're quote unquote scientific, they're repeatable, you can guarantee the outcome, and it's, all these delusions we have in sport about kind of a recipe oriented practice plan, periodization plan, or long-term development plan, versus finding the expert, finding the people who know how to cook, who can take a variety of ingredients, and whether you have carrots, black beans, and chicken, versus if you have a steak and, lettuce and half an apple, and figuring out a way to make that palatable and nourishing, that's the key thing. And, as our listeners listen to a lot of the anecdotes you guys give and a lot of the evidence that you present as they read your book, it's just remembering, like, the key thing as teachers is we're here to try to figure out what works for Johnny and Jane and Billy and each person independently, but also collectively. And I think that's where the art of coaching comes in.
Yeah, if I could add to that a little bit, Steve, in reading some of your work too, you talk about low-tech approaches to preparation and recovery. And we do some of that in the book, but I also introduce the high-tech, because we're in a technology revolution, might as well capitalize on the technologies out there. But we have a section of the book, and my great friend David Hemry, and he won the 68 400-meter hurdles in Mexico City, talks in his book and several books about the simple skill of imagery that we've almost all forgotten about in preparation to the big race in Mexico City, the finals. That he just lay down and imagine he was on the beach at Cape Cod training for this specific event that's going to occur in less than an hour. And he said he was just totally absorbed in imagery session of rehearsing himself in the full race and running, knowing what lane he was in, but who he's competing against, and seeing himself win all the time. But it was just a simple little exercise, but he talks about how engaged he was with that imagery session. There's nothing more low-tech than engaging in imagery. Not everybody can do it well, but David was a powerful user of it and a strong advocate of it today. I just wanted to mention that kind of low-tech approach to preparation in your sport, track and field.
And I'll say too, the one takeaway for parents, and I think a lot of coaches as well in team sports, and certainly John's seen this in soccer, is when we talk about, as Klein did, about building everyone's tacit knowledge, all those pattern recognition skills, etc., out on the field. But then you have, and I grew up, I was a sports parent. I said too much on the sidelines as well. But when you hear parents, coaching them from the sidelines, kick it here, pass it here, shoot, that disrupts everything that, they've been trying to learn as far as, this is my tacit knowledge. These are my pattern recognitions out there. I'm going to make the decisions. And unfortunately, you hear some coaches do that as well, where they coach play-by-play out on the field or with a basketball court, and they're telling them every single thing to do. And it's like, well, that's from your vantage point. This is from my vantage point out here on the field. So it's tough to do, but if parents and some of the coaches can understand that they're actually hurting their player by trying to give them, good advice and trying to tell them what they should do from their point of view, they're not going to be able to build that pattern recognition database like they could.
Oh, it's huge, yeah, and you see it on the track too. In the distance world, coaches, coach lap by lap. I used to be the same way, wanting to try to give some type of information or feedback so that the athlete could process what's going on in the race lap by lap. But at the end of, recently in the last several years, I've just stepped away and said nothing during the racing environment, because you're exactly right, Dan. It is about the athlete owning their pattern recognition and discernment and making the best decision they can in that moment. And yeah, it may cost them a win. It may cost them they may have made bad positioning, but the teachable moment is not in the heart of the competitive crucible. It's actually the brief afterwards.
Exactly.
And practice afterwards. And so that's where you as a coach, it's very important. You have to bite your tongue. And initially it's very hard because we have this very modern paradigm in our head as the coach being a Bobby Knight type figure, always yelling and,
Yeah.
making a big stink on the sidelines. But I think more and more and more we have to look at the, Steve Kerr or Brad Stevens, if we're going to use basketball coaches here, modern basketball coaches who have been very successful. They do something more important, which is create a culture of empowerment and discernment in their athletes before the game and day environment, and then let the athletes go do that, but then bring them aside either in a timeout or at halftime and very quietly, kind of get their feedback and debrief with them in order to help them go about their pattern recognition and decision making more proficiently, rather than getting all upset when they throw the ball out of bounds because someone misread a pass. And it's tough to do. It's easy to say, but it's tough to do.
So right. But it's pretty universally true.
Yeah, I think what's really cool is you're starting to see coaches at the highest level. You just mentioned Steve Kerr and Brad Stevens there, and then in your guys' book you mentioned Mike Sullivan, who are appreciating and understanding the impact that, like, understanding how to learn, how to teach, the cognitive side of it plays such a big role. We call it over coaching, or you could call it over parenting or over teaching. Which looks really good, on the sidelines for me or John or whoever to be screaming things. But the bottom line comes down to it is what's the impact that it's having. And a lot of times what happens is, as you guys pointed out, is we create athletes who become dependent on that information.
Yes.
When I first started coaching high school track, I remember, during the track, I'd get as close to it and start yelling stuff whenever the athlete would come by, lap by lap. And then I started to notice athletes, looking over at me during the race. And I was, in that moment, I was like, oh man, like I did something wrong. Like I just took this athlete out of this moment of competing where they're focused on competing against the athletes, that are around them and being in the moment, and I've taken them to me on the sideline yelling something. And that was like an aha moment for myself of being like, oh gosh, like this isn't the way to teach or coach what I want them to do.
Well, I always remind people, what does the teacher do on exam day? They sit in their chair quietly for an hour as students take the exam. They don't get up there and say, hey guys, by the way, the answer number 4 is A, the answer number 10 is C, and if you're following along, also the answer, they don't do that. The teaching happens before the test and after the test. And I think we have to remember competitions, whether they're races or games, they're tests of these, especially if you're coaching a scholastic setting, of a younger person who's developing competencies in a lot of not only physical domains, but more importantly cognitive or psychological domains, and those things are going to carry over and transfer potentially for the rest of their life. So why not take an empowerment approach? And people see me at track meets and they go, man, you just really not into it. I go, no, I'm really excited. I'm just very observant and I'm empowering the athlete. But after that athlete races, we'll sit there and, have a debrief for, if it went well, maybe 30 minutes. And if it didn't go so well, maybe 3 hours. But, they know they'll have my time and attention because I'm there astutely observing. But I don't need to be screaming wildly every 60 seconds as someone comes around the track to, create a theater about my coaching. It's, like you said, it detracts, right? And then help. And that's, again, if we go back to what teaching is about and coaching is about, it's about doing no harm from a Hippocratic Oath standpoint and actually elevating and leveling up someone and letting them do what they need to do on the day of competition, which is make the basket, hit the ball, or strike out, because they're all teachable moments on the back end that you can use to help evolve that person, however, their capacity or ability lets them.
Yeah, well said.
When we had a great opportunity to interview Brad Stevens, and he's got some great stuff in the book. And one of the things specifically on that point, he says in a quick quote, some of those are preparation errors, talking about mental mistakes during a game. Some of those are preparation errors, so it may be more how you focused in your preparation than it was in how you're focusing in the game. So just like you said, studying for the test, you didn't pay attention very well in practice when we were going over this, and you failed the test when you got in the game. And so, like he said, I can't do much in the game. But, if you're not paying attention during practice when I'm teaching you, then you're going to fail the test.
Exactly. No, those are some good points. So we're coming up on an hour here, and we don't want to keep you guys forever, but you guys, we've gone over some of the people you interviewed and you talked to, and I was just impressed by the vast array of experts in addition to yourself that you talked to, and even athletes and everything like that. Looking back on writing this book, who was your maybe favorite person to interview, or what surprised you coming away from an interview? Let's go with that.
You want to lead off?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I had the privilege of being in training camp with the Pittsburgh Penguins, and Coach Sullivan released the playmaker Sidney Crosby to spend better part of an afternoon with me. And Dan was on the phone at the other end, and we were firing questions here. But he was the most humble individual you can imagine from a playmaker superstar in the National Hockey League, arguably the best player in the world. But he just was so humble in answering questions and was curious about the kinds of questions we were asking. Just really felt honored to be asked these questions that he'd never thought about before. Nobody asked these kinds of questions that relate to decision making and the skill set that he has and how he got there. So he was one of my favorite individuals. But also dealing with international people like John Longmire in Australia with the Sydney Swans, Aussie rules football. He just has a great sense of humor, but he made it really clear to us that I'm glad you're asking these questions, because as a coach, that is the most difficult question to answer, and that is how do we improve the decision-making abilities of athletes in the sport of Aussie rules football, which, if you've ever watched it, it's a very fast-paced sport where you have to make quick decisions. It's very physical. Many of the athletes run the equivalent of a half a marathon during the course of a game on that big pitch. So it really lends itself well to kind of what we're trying to get at, is how do we enhance decision-making abilities of athletes. And it's a question that very few coaches have asked in the past. But we're hoping, Dan and I are both hoping, that now's the time that maybe we can sensitize the readers to asking that question and valuing its importance.
Yeah, and I would say, for me, Len's lived in this world for decades. Other than just being a fanboy and earning credibility points with my sons, like, yeah, I was on the phone with Sidney Crosby today. Yeah, I talked to Brad Stevens on the phone this afternoon, and they're like, seriously? Yeah. One of the things I thought it was interesting when we did talk to Coach Stevens was, for each one of our interviews, we started each one with, what is a playmaker? What is your definition of a playmaker? And they were all similar about, they're the player who makes everyone better around them, etc. And then we got a little more into the cognitive stuff. But when we were talking to Coach Stevens, and this was about 18 months ago, we asked him that question to kick off our interview. And Len and I guess we just kind of, thought that he would say in basketball, a point guard. And at the time, Isaiah Thomas was playing for the Celtics as a point guard. So we thought, he'll probably say Isaiah Thomas. And he said, no, he goes, Al Horford. And we said, really? And he said, yeah, absolutely. He goes, Al's got so much experience in this league. He has all of that tacit knowledge that we talk about. He said he helps all the young players. The vets look up to him and learn some things from him. So he said, yeah, absolutely. Al Horford is my playmaker. And even this last season with the Celtics and all of the injuries they had, but they got so far in the playoffs. And again, interview after interview, he would point to Horford as, this is the guy who's leading our team. This is our playmaker. And I thought that was interesting and really kind of changed our perspective. It's not always the person you think it is. And for a lot of coaches, they're saying, we have one or two playmakers who are ready to go, but of course we would like to develop a lot more players who have those cognitive abilities and have that ability to make quick decisions when the pressure is on. So that has been a lot of fun.
Oh, that's awesome. I love those answers. And particularly the Sidney Crosby one, because I was before I got into running, I was somehow a hockey fan, even though I grew up in Houston, Texas. So I was a Penguins fan with Mario Lemieux and Jaromir Jagr and all those guys.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was a particular treat to read in the book. Well,
yeah, the other thing I'd like to add while we were talking about Crosby, it reminded me of when I asked the question of early specialization of athletes in sports, and he and all of the other coaches and athletes we spoke to just were strong proponents of playing multiple sports at a young age. And Crosby talked about and he said anything where there was a ball or a puck or doing track and field, he did it all. And he said he encouraged everybody to do that. He said it's crazy to narrow down a sport at a real young age and move into it. And coaches all said the same. So it reminded me when talking to Crosby, not only his humbleness, but this whole notion of early specialization is just a no-no. And likewise with Brad and the Celtics, he was a strong advocate of sampling different sports at a young age.
yeah, that's such a good point to make. And I think, hopefully the younger coaches listening and parents listening to the podcast will really take that home, because, you can almost tie it all up with it was that kind of misinterpretation of Erickson's work that probably pushed us towards that early specialization. Yes. And like now we're having that understanding and counter back to say, hey, wait a second, that's not what that meant. And and that's not the best way to do it, because it can be incredibly damaging for a kid, both from a growth and development side, but also from a psychological side, to tie his whole kind of sense of self and identity at an early age into a sport that he might grow out of relatively quickly.
Sure.
So, well, I just wanted to thank both of you guys, Len and Dan. You guys wrote a fantastic book. I can't say that enough. I've read it, got tons of notes that I'm trying to apply to my coaching right now. We appreciate your time on the podcast. If you guys have, I'm sure the book is available everywhere. But if you guys have a website or anything else that, listeners can find you at and follow along, feel free to share.
Yeah, so Len is involved with several different companies, but we've also partnered up as follow-up to the book. And so we can be found at 80percentmental.com. That's the numbers 80 and then words percentmental.com. And then, like you said, the book came out June 12th in North America. It's on Amazon. It's on all the bookstores, etc. Coming out in the UK next month, as well as Australia. There's a hardcover version, ebook version, and an audio version. So anywhere really you want to buy your book, hopefully you can find it there.
Well, fantastic. We'll put links to the book, 80% Mental, and other things we talked about, including show notes, in our show notes on scienceofrunning.com or highperformancewest.com for you regular listeners, so you can guys go there and connect with what Dan and Len have done. But once again, I want to thank you guys for being on the podcast. This was a lot of fun. I'm going to have to go back through the 3 pages of notes I took while listening and might have to listen again to apply all this to my coaching. So this was fantastic, guys. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, guys. You guys have made an amazing resource with this book. It took me about 10 years to kind of search and discover everything you guys whittled down to a couple hundred pages. So kudos to you and the hard work it did to do that. And by all means, any coach listening to this, it is a valuable asset to pick up, and I'm sure you'll revisit it and reapply the learnings and teachings over and over again. So thank you, because I know this was not an easy thing to do.
Thanks so much for your wonderful comments, Jonathan and Steve. Dan and I are both most grateful.
Yes, thanks a lot, and we love the podcast.
All right.